I couldn't possibly cover all of it, and I'll be focusing mainly on Marvel and DC, so please bear with me if you would. I'll start with the Golden Age, and I'll try not to go over too much of the history that my other presenters so well and so graciously went over, so I'll try to avoid duplication. I'll adapt, with no hard feelings. And the Golden Age, the first really modern comic books in the 30s and 40s, was basically the age of the plucky career woman, the femme fatale, and just more independent-minded heroines. Basically, dames. And I admit, I expected that I'd have to, the usual story that they tell us, I'd have to rely on men to tell women's stories. And I'm glad to say that wasn't the case when I started digging. And that's often also the case. When you really dig deep, there really are hidden, unacknowledged histories of women telling their own stories. And I found that not only just in graphic novels, but also in comic strips, which also contained a number of superhero stories. And women gained more traction here because you could use a more neutral pseudonym and just send in your work. So I found out about a number of women. I'm just going to name off a few: Nina Albright, Ruth Atkinson, Toni Bloom, Ramona Fradon, Barbara Hall, Alice Marble, Tarquin Mills, Ruth Roche, Dorothy Woolfolk, and Mills actually created a character named Miss Fury. She was the first female superhero, and this hero actually adopted a child and had to win over authorities to do so as a single mother. And she actually employed a friend of hers as a governess to help out, since that friend had lost her job to returning servicemen. So at one point, a woman was writing about a single mother who was raising a child with her best friend. And another one, Brenda Starr, was about a reporter, and she's actually still around today. Recently, she made a movie. There was a movie made, well, actually not recently, in 1989, with Brooke Shields. Not too successful. One of the most progressive ones was Jill Trent, Science Sleuth. She was a genius inventor who was also a detective who solved crimes with her friend Daisy, who was skilled in combat. And she didn't have a male love interest, but she and Daisy were sometimes known sharing a bed. So progressive in many ways. And part of a proud tradition comic books have taken on. So one of the few ways they were often diverse. So another one I love was Pat Parker, war nurse, and her band of helpers, the Girl Commandos. She was just a British nurse who decided to put on a superhero costume and help fight Nazis. And she had an international team, one of whom was a Chinese woman, Mei Ling, who was depicted in a very non-racist way. Shocking, especially for the time. And it was also written and drawn by a woman, Jill Elgin. So she bears very strong resemblance to the oldest and probably most famous female superhero that came out during that era, Wonder Woman. And of course, Wonder Woman's going through a kind of renaissance with the recent movie, perhaps you've heard of it, little star called Gal Gadot starring in it. And there was also a movie last year about her creation called Professor Marston and the Wonder Woman, highly recommended. And this was also the era where some of the most iconic women in comics were created, like Lois Lane and Catwoman, even if they didn't have their own series at the time. And you could do a whole presentation on these two alone and how they evolved or regressed over the years. So yes, while some of these heroines did have unfortunate characteristics, I found one, Sheba the Jungle Queen, so much racism. But there were a variety of heroines. Again, for the time, pretty much all of them were white, but they also had very distinct personalities. Some had love interests, some didn't, and almost all of them were independent, mostly saved themselves, and went out and got things done. It was a very stark contrast to the next era, what would come later, the Silver Age of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, and my computer's being weird, so no, that's not what I want. Okay. Sorry, just bear with me. Okay, this was the post-war era when the men were returning home and the trends actually shifted away from superheroes, and almost all of these heroes bit the dust. Pretty much Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman were really the only ones who survived. The trend became more about horror, crime, romance, especially in the 50s. And this is when comic books really came under suspicion, were blamed for all sorts of social problems, such as juvenile delinquency, and were said to be corrupting the youth. You've always got to have a scapegoat. So in 1954, the Comics Code was adapted and remained for about 60 years. It only officially ended in 2011. So this was a long era of comics censoring themselves in order to avoid government regulation, which was a possibility since there were actual Senate hearings about comics. And with this censorship, conservative trends advocating for women to go back into the home, and this meant the beginning of the girlfriend era. Women essentially became prominent only if they were dating the hero. And this actually became a part of DC's official policy in the 50s. And I quote, this was their policy, "The inclusion of females in stories is specifically discouraged. Women, when used in plot structure, should be secondary in importance and should be drawn realistically without exaggeration of feminine physical qualities."
Wow.
And they were serious about this. To give an example, in 51, Catwoman got hit on the head. She discovered she had amnesia. She was really a mild-mannered flight attendant, and she didn't want to be involved in crime anymore. She made a brief appearances after that, and then disappeared from comics for about 12 years, from 54 to 66. So, meanwhile, Wonder Woman focused on marriage and modeling and worked at a Lonely Hearts column. So, in the 60s, she actually gave up her powers to stay with her love interest, Steve. And at least she learned martial arts and is still doing adventures, but threaten much, guys? No. And Lois Lane, oh my goodness. Lois Lane's relationship with Superman, they took this independent-driven career woman and made her much more, basically they focused on her schemes and dreams to marry Superman. And this was when she really became a damsel in distress. And the cover, she got her own series, which was called Superman's Girlfriend, Lois Lane.
Wow.
And to its credit, in the 70s, the series did focus more on serious issues, but long era where she was basically the damsel girlfriend. And Marvel could only do better than this. And in the 60s, not only saw the birth of the many superheroes we know today, such as Daredevil, Spider-Man, Hulk, Fantastic Four, X-Men, and the Avengers, and many of these did have prominent female characters, such as the Invisible Girl, the Wasp, Jean Grey, or Marvel Girl as she was known at the time. And often they were the weakest links in the team, but they were there, and there was a lot of potential for them to grow, unlike many in DC. And for the most part, many of the female characters seem to be there to be just sexy and flirtatious. And now there's obviously nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with being sexual or a flirtatious woman, but it shouldn't be your only character trait. So, and for the most part it was. And during all this, women actually were still creating for the major companies, but for the most part, they were leftovers from the golden age who were able to keep their jobs and also had to work in other areas such as books, especially for kids. And from this era onward until about the late 80s, pretty much all the female artists I found, they worked in the underground comic scene, and they actually managed to talk about feminism, women's issues, and they were helping other women succeed. And many of these eras, the divide between them, they aren't exactly official, but many consider the end of the Silver Age and the beginning of the next one to be the snap heard round the world, aka Gwen Stacy's death. And I'm sure many of you are familiar, but basically, for those not, what happened was Spider-Man and his main nemesis, the Green Goblin, were battling on top of a bridge, and the Green Goblin threw Gwen Stacy off. So Spider-Man shoots a web and pulls her up, and he thinks he saved her, but when he pulls her up, he discovers she's dead, and he might have been the one to accidentally kill her by breaking her neck. So this was shocking at the time, not so much today. But when heroes experienced a failure like this, it was part of their origin story, and they saved everyone after that. So, and Gwen also had a very large fan base. So, of course, like I said, this has become business as usual, and whenever a hero needs a or a dramatic shift, it's become common to kill off the girlfriend. Which brings us to the Bronze Age. 70s, 80s. And obviously there was a dramatic shift in the 70s. A lot of the older people were retiring, the standards were being loosened in the Comics Code, and the younger generation made a point of including social issues in their storylines, not only including them, but using them to sell comics. So during this time, existing female heroes were given new strengths, Like the Invisible Girl finally became the Invisible Woman, the Wasp led the Avengers for a while and made a point to recruit other women to the team. The She-Hulk was introduced, and around this, Black Panther was around before that, but he really came to prominence around this time. A lot of minority heroes, Luke Cage, and most, well, not most importantly, but the thing that made probably the biggest change was the X-Men were revamped. Chris Claremont, he gets and deserves a lot of the credit for creating these characters, these women who were confident and powerful from the beginning, such as Storm, who was stereotypical at the time, but she was one of the most powerful X-Men from the beginning. She was strong, she was confident, she had a friggin' personality, and she's still one of the most famous black superheroes today. And 13-year-old Kitty Pryde, a Shadowcat who could phase through objects. She became the youngest member of the X-Men, and she turned many of the stereotypical presentations of young women in comics on their head. And unfortunately, there are also some very big misses along with the hits. For example, the female villain Thunder was from an alternate reality where the US had become the United Sisterhood Republic, where women had killed most of the men and enslaved the rest. Another villain was named Mankiller, was a professional skier, was challenged to a race by an anti-feminist man who then caused an accident that not only resulted in his death, but broke her legs and left her with scars. She was then given powers by a militant group of feminists. Then there was Miss Marvel, or as she's known now, Captain Marvel. Next year, obviously, she'll be Marvel's first female superhero to have her own solo movie. However, she had a very troubled history during the time she was first created. She was actually introduced in the 60s, but didn't become a superhero until 1977, and was given the name Miss Marvel along with the tagline, "This female fights back." So yeah, so many instances of trying way too hard, and the costume, I don't have anything wrong. I don't have anything against sexy costumes, but just for God's sake, make it practical, especially if you're trying to make the hero feminist. So anyway, one of the most horrible things Marvel has ever done, I think, happened with her. In 1980, Marvel wanted to do something special for the 200th issue of the Avengers, and this is making me angry. Turn to a stereotypical angry feminist, so I'm gonna have to take this off. It was decided that Miss Marvel would become pregnant. Nothing wrong with that, but just how she became pregnant is just so many different shades of wrong. It is hard to imagine how anyone thought this was remotely okay or acceptable. So at the beginning of this issue, she finds out she's pregnant. By the third day, it's come to term, and she gives birth in this weirdly painless non-birth with all her fellow Avengers present. And afterwards, of course, she's angry and confused while the rest of the Avengers are weirdly happy about the birth. So she can't remember how she's got pregnant, so of course she has no idea who the father was. She's hurt and angry, and it gets worse. The child grows into an adult man named Marcus who falls in love with his own mother. It gets worse. The one who impregnated her turns out to be Marcus, and he became attracted to her partly because she resembled his mother. It gets worse. Marcus devised a plan to escape Limbo, a place he was trapped in, by abducting a human woman and impregnating her with his essence so he could be born on Earth. And still not the worst. Marcus abducted, then wooed Miss Marvel with poetry, clothes, and music. And mind control machines. To quote or paraphrase how he explains it, "To aid my purpose, I sought others from Earth's time continuum. I had Shakespeare write you a sonnet. I had Beethoven perform, while Marie Antoinette herself clothed you in the finest. Finally, after relative weeks of such efforts, and admittedly with a subtle boost from Immortus's machines, you became mine." They show Miss Marvel enjoying the sex that they have. It's still not the worst part. When Marcus realizes he has to return to Limbo to save the world, Miss Marvel says she's developed feelings for him, and the fact that he's in a way her child makes her feel close to him. The Avengers are fine with this. Let her go with him and say all they can do is hope she gets a happy ending. Thankfully, X-Men writer Chris Claremont restored her dignity by kind of taking over the character, having her stay with the X-Men after, Marcus dies, which means the brainwashing wears off, and she's like, oh my God. I been raped, and nobody noticed. None of my teammates noticed. And Miss Marvel comes back to Earth and took the Avengers to task for allowing this to happen. And today, she is one of the most powerful and central important characters in Marvel. Okay, and DC, they may have gone through an implosion, but at this point, they also revived the Teen Titans and introduced new female characters, some of the most important ones to the team, the empath Raven and the alien Starfire, whose portrayal could be problematic at times. New 52, like sex, only there to be a sex object, but anyway. She's still one of the most popular and recognizable superheroes. And this was also a time when underground comics really started to flourish, both due to trends and changes in disposition. And this is really the era where a lot of the female artists got their start, and in the end of the previous Silver Age, the beginning of the Bronze Age. So a whole lot of women working in the underground comic scene. And I'll try and hurry up because apparently my time is almost up. The modern age, the mid-'80s to the present. And it's also called the Dark Age of comics. It's the era of Watchmen, one of the most well-known, critically and commercially successful comic books was published. You know, I'm sure you guys have heard of it. several lists. It's on several lists of best novels, and it subverted the whole concept of the superhero, and it contained a very interesting depiction of a mother-daughter relationship and two silk specters, obviously. Both very flawed, complicated women, and for the most part, non-stereotypical. And Robin kind of went through a revamp in The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller before he went insane. And that featured a 13-year-old female Robin named Carrie Kelly, very competent, saves Batman's life a couple times. Of course, she was problematic later and was called jailbait, but anyway. And of course, anti-heroes become a big thing, with many new ones being created and established ones going darker, and sometimes this meant the creation of more complicated female characters, female anti-heroes like Elektra, but often this meant women were used as plot devices to give men more of a personal backstory. Alan Moore's The Killing Joke in 1988, the Joker shooting Barbara Gordon, aka Batgirl, paralyzing her, then photos were shown of her father naked and in pain to torment Commissioner Gordon further. And the 2016 movie of this is actually worse, takes all the worst elements and emphasizes them. Not recommended. And as previous presenter mentioned, this is called Fridging, and it was after feminist comic books created a site called Women in Refrigerators in 1999 to critique stuff like this. It was actually inspired by the Green Lantern comic, where the hero, Kyle Rayner, comes home to find that the villain has killed his girlfriend and stuffed her into the refrigerator. So, of course, this cements the hatred between them and leads to a whole thing. And sure, people tried to kind of counter-argue that male heroes are often hurt, but they're often returned to their original state. It's a phase, but Barbara Gordon wasn't restored until relatively recently. She became Batgirl again, but by then people objected because she'd become Oracle and had become a very unique kind of hero. And on the positive side, the popular feminist comic Tanker was created. The heroine wasn't an outlaw with a punk clothing and a shaved head. LGBT characters had become more prominent with Batwoman and major additions to the X-Men. Catwoman became very prominent, and animated series flourished, although they often weren't quite as diverse. They've gotten more so. Some of them were very acclaimed, such as a little showing. Maybe some of you have heard of Batman the Animated Series, which gave us Harley Quinn in 1992. Proved so popular, she was incorporated into the comics and now has her own series, and obviously started off as the Joker's very abused sidekick, very dark relationship, but now she's broken up with him, has her own team. She's an anti-heroine in her own right, and she's probably more popular than the Joker now. So yes. And there's also stuff called the Hawkeye Initiative, which posed male superheroes, such as Hawkeye, in the same hypersexualized pose and dress as women were typically given. So yeah, you could say women have made a kind of comeback, and more women are writing about women. They're writing about established male characters. They're creating, they're illustrating, they're editing. I found so many more examples of women doing this and all their impressive work, and I want to cite one example in particular, Karen Berger, who has become a legend in the comic book world. She founded Vertigo, was very instrumental in works like Sandman, iZombie, and Preacher, and then she left in 2013 to found an entire comics line, Berger Books. I've seen it myself in Chicago, where I live now, where we have Women's Comic Night, and so many women show up. There's such a variety of creators, like non-binary. I met a Native American artist, and so yeah, they become, yeah, obviously Jane Foster became Thor for a while. That was fun. I digress. And as mentioned, Miss Marvel and Spider-Gwen, a comic set on an alternate Earth where Gwen Stacy was the one bit by a spider and then accidentally killed her best friend Peter Parker. She-Hulk, Birds of Prey, the Hellcat, Squirrel Girl, who was the girl with squirrel powers who can somehow not be defeated, has defeated Galactus, Doctor Doom.
Thanos.
And then Bitch Planet, about various women who've been exiled to a prison planet for being non-compliant. Faith, a plus-size superhero with telekinesis and the ability to fly, and whose weight has nothing to do with her powers or has any bearing on her life. And of course, the movies, the TV shows, Scarlet and Riverdale, Jessica Jones, Supergirl, Wonder Woman, Harley Quinn and Suicide Squad, Laura and Logan, and Alison Bechdel, her thing about her father being turned into a musical. Yeah, I'm trying to rush. Fun Home. Yeah, comics have expanded far beyond superhero stories to become the go-to thing for memoirs. Can't we talk about something more pleasant? Rod Chast about her elderly parents' end-of-life care. My favorite is Hyperbole and a Half, where Allie Brosh discusses her weird life experiences and her struggles with depression. And this book was so funny. I was actually in a coffee shop when I read it, and I laughed so loud and hard I was worried that other people would question my sanity. Every time I read it, I laugh out loud. So, and other comic books they're creating which are less hard to classify: Shade the Changing Girl, Monstrous, Lumberjanes, and Buffy, who's continued her run in comic book form. And so, as you can probably guess, I'm pretty optimistic about the future of comic books and the role women have to play in them. Practically every area of the entertainment industry is opening up and becoming less reliant on gatekeepers, and comic books are no exception. More unique stories and characters are being focused on, and even big corporations are finally starting to discover that, hey, diversity isn't just